So yeah, we are going to start almost the last session on this conference called Connecting Research, Policy and Practice Through Effective Evidence Brokering. We've talked a lot yesterday about practices in school and today hardly on evidence generation and evidence use. But for policymakers and practitioners to thoughtfully engage with research evidence, brokers and intermediary organizations play an important role. Organizations that haven't been mentioned so far in this conference, except maybe for Rin, who identified himself as a knowledge broker. There was also Mikel, who identified his Bofill Foundation as an intermediary organization. And these organizations live, let's say, in this in-between zone between policy, research, and practice. But they are more than just a go-between. They support researchers to generate relevant and contextualized evidence, but they also support potential users of this evidence to use it and to engage with in policy and practice. So this session will look at the growing body of research on what it means to be an effective broker or an effective intermediary organization, why it's not being put fully into practice yet, and how education system can support better use of intermediaries. And to give you a small context on this topic, I will leave you again with Nóra Révai. Nóra Révai, as you may know, is the project leader of the Strengthening the Impact of Education research, and maybe most importantly, she's my manager, so welcome.
And I should be grateful that he didn't call me boss, which is what he does always. So thank you, Jose, for introducing this session. And I would like to start this actually with understanding what brokers and brokerage is. And for that, I would like to use a couple of metaphors that have been used in the literature for this concept. And you will recognize many of the discussions that we have had over these past 1.5 years. The first one is a broker as a translator. And this is kind of a very basic thing of translating research, usually seen as a push approach, as Tracy was talking about. Translating research papers for practitioners or policymakers. And a translator doesn't even necessarily have to meet any of these parties. They can just be in their office, take a research paper, a synthesis, and make it user-friendly, more accessible, and so on. And as Tracy emphasized, this is actually extremely important. It is important to have available evidence and something that is accessible for users, but certainly not enough. Another metaphor that has been used is a boundary spanner. And this is based more on the concept that there is the research community, the practitioner community, the policymaker community, and of course much more, coming back to Tracy's complex slide of actors, and that brokers or intermediaries span these boundaries. Often these communities have very different they use different language, they have different contextual understandings and knowledge. And so we probably need people who bridge these communities. A similar one is that of a mediator. And it's perhaps a little bit more than a boundary spanner in the sense that a mediator also has the job of actually generating the interaction between different people, which can be very difficult. They have to manage power dynamics, for example, which is something that comes up very often. And Rin used an example, a policymaker in a room who says, I am not an expert. So there is often this kind of power dynamics, both with practice and research and policy and research. And a mediator's job is to generate an interaction in which everybody feels equal and which is a meaningful interaction around evidence and around questions of practice and policy. And there is a much more recent metaphor. I'm actually super nervous here. because this metaphor comes from Jonathan Sharples, who is in the room. Where are you, Jonathan? So that I can be more stressed. Oh yeah, thank you. So I'm gonna do probably a very poor job, and then Jonathan will correct me at his table. So this is a metaphor of a jazz band, and in here, brokers or brokerage institutions actually take account of the very broad set of actors, all of those that Tracy spoke about in her session, and they try and understand who plays what instrument, what are their roles, give them the space to play their own instrument, get them collaborate in different groups maybe. You know, in a jazz band, you have solos, you have pieces when a few of the musicians play together, but it's not random, yeah? There is a framework of a song, it is coordinated. They know what they are doing, everyone knows what they are doing. So this role is more of this coordinator kind of more systems role. Jonathan, I'm really, really scared of you, but... And so then the next question is, who are these brokers? We use this term, but do we actually know who they are? And Rien said he is a broker, nice. We have one in the room who identifies, Michelangelo as well. And we tended to think of these brokers as kind of formal roles. For example, Education Endowment Foundation, and John is with us, is a clear agency that has this explicit mandate. Their role in the system is to provide access to evidence and facilitate the use of this evidence among practitioners. But actually, there are many actors who do not have this explicit mandate, but who still play an important role in this field. And we wanted to acknowledge all of these actors, and we ran a survey last year, a survey of knowledge mobilization, and I will a little bit expand on what we mean by that. And we got responses from close to 300 organizations from 34 countries. And our aim was really to characterize knowledge mobilization, so these kind of brokerage activities across a range of different organizations, and also to learn about their effectiveness and impact. So we included in our survey research institutions, formal intermediaries, so these kind of formal institutes that have actually an explicit mandate to do this, public intermediaries, which would be knowledge units like the one Rien works in the Dutch ministry, initial teacher education institutions, consultancies, funding organizations, teacher unions, inspectorates, quality agency, services, and others. It's important to note that respondents could select several of these categories because, of course, they are not fully distinct. And the most common overlap was research institutions at the same time being initial teacher education institutions, which is quite common in many countries. And this is the number of responses per type of organization that we had. Now, before I show you some of the results, what did we mean by knowledge mobilization? We use this concept very broadly to refer to any kind of intentional effort that aims to facilitate the use of research evidence in policy and practice, super broad. What does this encompass? And here, I'm very grateful to Tracy that she has already done the job in my place. We used the conceptual framework that was adapted originally from Alan Best and Beth Holmes' work, and that has been used in this space for a long time. So we included these classic linear approaches, which is partly about generating relevant evidence. So, for example, conducting systematic reviews, doing intervention program evaluations, and then disseminating this, for example, through curating and maintaining evidence repositories, mentioned in the previous session, disseminating research in user-friendly forums, establishing communication channels. We know from research that this is not enough, and we also included relational approaches, things like mapping research users and mobilizers, facilitating collaboration among actors, but also offering training, coming back to Eric's example here, offering training and capacity building for practitioners and policymakers to improve their skills, also for researchers, to improve their skills of communicating their work, but also understanding the context of policy and practice, and skills of brokers. And then we also included more systems approaches which see this as a more holistic thing and which aim to to improve the culture more generally, so including, for example, building leadership capacity, supporting the development and implementation of policies in ministries or practices within schools, directly working with these institutions on a longer-term basis, supporting scale-up and sustainability of knowledge mobilization, coordinating knowledge mobilization at the level of the system, so being the lead of that jazz band, and very importantly, creating infrastructure processes, incentives in the system. So be prepared, a tough slide is coming. This is a heat map generated based on this question. So we actually asked respondents how frequently and how intensively they engage in all of these activities. So in the rows, you can see all of the activities that I have just talked about. In the columns, you see the types of organizations. And the heat map is showing or is reflecting the percentage of the organizations that reported that they do that activity systematically or to a large extent. Okay, so when it's red, it means that a lot of them do this activity to a large extent, basically. So first point that I want to make is that the aim is not to make this whole thing red. It would probably be bad if everybody was doing everything at the same time. Finance ministers wouldn't approve it, I'm sure. But this heat map can still tell us quite a lot. One of the things is the blue lines. What are the activities that almost no one is doing? And I would just like to highlight two of these. In the middle, training researchers to communicate their research skills, coming back to Mackie's point. Very, very few organizations reported that they do this. And training brokers to develop these kind of brokerage intermediary skills, almost no one is doing. So this is maybe something we have to think about when we think of those systems approaches. Another thing that we can see in this chart is whether the right actor is doing the right thing. And I want to give one example for that. In the middle, you have training practitioners to help them use research. And then you look at initial teacher education institution, and it's a light red rectangle. That light red hides 47% of IT institutions who do this systematically. I would personally argue that it should be 100%. So probably there is a lot to unpack here, and I think this heat map can make us think about how do we need to think about the global picture of knowledge mobilization in a country. But we don't have time to go into that. One important thing, maybe a lot of organizations report actually doing, it's not that negative, this heat map, I think. A lot of them report doing a lot of different activities. Are these activities effective? What do we know about their impact? So we also asked organizations whether they monitor or evaluate the impact of their activities. And you can see that more than half of them don't. Slightly less than half, at least occasionally do so, which is actually quite positive. But then we asked them about what kind of indicators do you use, what kind of measures do you use to monitor your impact. And unsurprisingly, most of them use easy-to-measure indicators: number of downloads of your reports, number of clicks on the website, number of people who participated in an event or a workshop, which does tell us about the reach of the activities. It doesn't tell us much about the impact. We don't know if these activities actually result in behavioral change. Will teachers then use research better or more? Will policymakers improve, or researchers improve these processes? We don't know. We know much less about that. And there are some good examples I must highlight. And we are now working on our last report, and we certainly want to highlight some qualitative good examples also for organizations that do this, that actually measure behavioral impact and research use impact. John referred to this earlier, that the EEF does. Very few of them do. And this is the last slide and the last thing I wanted to highlight. So actors, all of those actors that Tracy mentioned, and their relationships are, of course, at the core of understanding and facilitating the use of research evidence. but they do not sit in and do not operate in a vacuum. They are in a system, and in this system there are no appropriate resources, financial resources, human resources. They may or may not have access to good incentives, and we definitely mentioned the elephant in the room, which is academic incentives, which are not very helpful in most countries. And then they do have or do not have access to structures and processes that facilitate their work. And Reen gave us, and the previous panel gave us several examples of such structures and processes, like Javier's example of a funding mechanism that's both a resource but also actually a process of facilitating this work, ways of generating interactions. Yesterday we had examples from Cindy, for example, Cindy Portman, on learning conversation, which is a process through which this can be improved. And this all of this is kind of surrounded by leadership, which we think is an absolutely key aspect at every single level within schools, but also more broadly at the local, regional, and system level. And with that, I'll hand back to Jose for the discussion questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Nóra. Yes, so we wanted to have now a more interactive session. It's been a lot of us talking here and you listening, and we want to talk to each other now. And this wouldn't be possible without the help of our expert facilitators. Each of the tables has one assigned, and they are so good at facilitating that I'm not going even to introduce them. They are going to introduce themselves. I'm going to explain you a bit the dynamic of these small group discussions. We will have 2 rounds of discussions, each of 30 minutes. It should start probably with an icebreaker. Maybe you can introduce yourselves, a short 10 seconds presentation, your name, the organization you represent. And then the facilitator is going to introduce their work, maybe following these 3 discussion tables that we have here. Is it? Oh, okay, it worked. Probably you won't have time to discuss the 3 questions in just one 30-minute session, so that's why we have 2. And for the second session, we are going to ask the facilitators to rotate tables, so you can have a new audience, you can have new voices to listen to. And I think that's it. Yeah, pretty simple, pretty straightforward. So I wish you all a fruitful conversation with your tables. Thanks again to the facilitators, and thank you all for being here. We still have 2 minutes, 2 final minutes, so please start wrapping up your ideas. Yeah, thank you. It was my dream to do that. Sorry to cut your conversations. I know that I'm pretty sad to end this conversation, but we want to give everyone to have a chance to speak with another facilitator. So we'll ask for our expert to rotate. We'll make them rotate to the left, yeah? Maybe the two tables in the center can swap. So Melissa and Håkon, you can swap. And the rest, please. There is one left.
Enjoy.
How many left do you have? You have two left? Is that like clockwise? Yeah. Okay, so the dynamic will be the same. We'll start with an icebreaker, but I guess that you already know each other now. So maybe you can do a summary of your conversation in the table, so that you don't overlap in this second round of conversations. And then 5 minutes of the facilitator introducing their work, and 25 minutes of open discussion following the questions. Thank you very much. Sorry, what? Yeah, I don't want to cut her, sorry. I'm a polite person. Sorry, we're entering the last minute of the discussion, so please start wrapping up the ideas. Oh, not really great. You can do it again. Yeah. Thank you, Chris. So time is up. Sorry to interrupt you. I hope you had fruitful conversation as much as I did in this table. I wanted to thank again the facilitators, and I will actually bother them with one last favor. I will ask you to, maybe in 30 seconds, if we have the time, to give me the main insight from these 2 rounds of discussion that you had in each table. And I'll start with our own Melissa Muthan.
Thank you, Jose. So at our tables, at the 2 tables that I led, I talked about the OECD's role as a knowledge broker in education. And I think one of the takeaways that I would say is how is the OECD appreciated as a knowledge broker? And it seems to still really be the networks that we facilitate. So we really do bring people together. So I think relational knowledge mobilization activities seem to be really appreciated. But we also talked about how we could branch out into more systems approaches. So I've had some good discussions and good ideas on that as well. Thank you.
Right, not an easy task to summarize, but I was talking about the policy analysis unit we have within the Ministry of Education in Norway, and I work as a knowledge broker. So I have kind of the same role as Rien. Right, there you are. We found that having such a policy unit with the role of a knowledge broker is a strategic choice in the ministry in order to surveil the sector and ministry knowledge needs and communicate these needs to the research institutions. You need a spearhead within the ministry to work with the Research Council and the Statistics Norway to develop the statistics and the research in our sector, and also to use that to mediate it inside the ministry and make sure that the policy-making processes are knowledge-based within our ministry. So that was we talked about and had a good discussion on how we can do that and how we can meet some of the challenges which you have also raised from the stage these 2 days.
Thank you, Håkon. Rin, please.
So interestingly, there are a lot of brokers in the room. So I asked all the people on the table, do you consider yourself a broker? And most of the people considered themselves a broker. So this is already interesting. I haven't asked them if they were trained to be a broker, but that would be a nice follow-up question. So, and we had brokers at different levels also. Also interesting, I think, brokers from within the ministry, within a system, but also international brokers like the OECD, but we had people on the table from UNESCO, and then from research institutes. So brokers at different positions, also interesting. We talked about, at this table, about the kind of the role of broker in mediating the micro level and the macro level. And we discussed this because one of our people at the table asked, where do you start a kind of research use project? And there needs to be a kind of knowledge flow between what happens at the macro level, it could be international, and what happens at the micro level, and brokers could fulfill a role in that. This is more than 30 seconds, right? So I'm going to quit it. But in this knowledge flow between the macro and the micro. And interesting at this table was the role of librarians in knowledge brokerage, which is really interesting, right? They are specialists in finding research, right? Or finding any kind of resource you need. And at the other table we had, I think, a discussion on reaching the role of a broker in reaching common ground. Or how do you come to the questions that start such a research use process, that you need a kind of mechanisms, platforms to reach common ground between all the players at the table.
Thank you, Rin. If anyone here is a broker and has received broker training, please contact us. Thank you. Wow, good reception. No, actually, based on the results of the survey that Nóra just showed, training in brokerage is one of the least done activities among the intermediaries that we survey. So actually, yeah, we're searching for some promising cases. Maybe Jonathan has an answer for that?
No. Yeah, we covered quite a bit. I mean, we were focusing on how do we create these functioning evidence systems using this sort of jazz band analogy about, you know, people understand and are playing these coordinated roles. One of the things we were saying is that we shouldn't expect every actor to play the same role. It sounds obvious, but you know, we don't need every teacher to be conducting action research or be kind of doing research, but we need people within schools to be doing that, and that to be feeding in and supporting, you know, what the school is doing. We were saying there's value in trying to understand the nature of the research use system, where before you start thinking about what you do around that. So where roles and responsibilities lie, where are the strengths and weaknesses in that evidence use system, and that's going to differ in different countries, and it's going to differ on different topics. We're talking about creativity. The evidence use system on creativity is going to look different as it would do on maths. So we can be kind of diagnostic in understanding the nature of the evidence system and then using that to be more intelligent about where we intervene to improve that system. We discussed how we want a balance. These systems work best when there's kind of bottom-up or local ownership and empowerment, but at the same time you need top-down coordination. So again, using that jazz band analogy, people need to feel as though they can express themselves, play their role, they feel empowered to do stuff, but it's not just kind of random noise, there's kind of coordination between it. And then finally, we were just talking about what are the incentives in these systems for brokers to work collaboratively? You know, the way in which we're set up often to compete for funding, they compete for kind of space and attention isn't always conducive to meaningful collaboration and partnership across different actors and organisations as part of this system. So there's a question there about how do we kind of align and get the incentives right for these, to work a bit more harmoniously, I guess, within these research use systems.
Thank you. So actually you did have an answer, because in our table we talk actually about the mismatch between the incentives in co-production research in both among researchers and policymakers. So Annika?
Yes, well, at our tables, our discussion really circled around the question of how to make the process of brokerage more sustainable and what is needed in order to provide for this. And at the first table, we had a deeper discussion on the ways of communication, also pointing to the fact that we also need to understand the levels of policy making, that we need different types of communication with policymakers actually at different levels of the process of policy making, and that maybe even brokers are not always aware of these different steps when to get into the process. So we had a deeper discussion on this, and also on the accessibility of evidence and how brokers can contribute to making evidence more accessible, which also needs that we do need to rely on infrastructures that do help informing this system and exchange. And then on the second table, we had a deeper discussion on the importance of collaboration in the process and how we can have a more collaborative process, even if we cannot expect every policymaker or practitioner to always join the whole process from the beginning, but how can we actually include them on a level that is respective and that really helps to include every perspective without just saying, okay, you need to do this, you need to do that. So how can collaboration really work between policymakers, practitioners, researchers, and what is the role of brokers to ensure this at different points in the process? And this also led us to a discussion more on the meta level on actually how to keep the balance, what is the task of a broker to keep the balance between a very structured process and some permanent mechanisms that are needed so that the whole process is effective, and how can we actually get it to a point where it's not always inventing everything anew, but that is effective and sustainable. But also how do we keep the flexibility that we may need to react to current challenges, to integrate new perspectives, to not lose touch of maybe new networks that are coming up and that are important. So how do we actually keep the balance between permanent structures and flexibility in order to have a sustainable system of brokerage? And we were circling around this.
Thank you, Annika. Yeah, actually, the results of the policy survey show that one of the main barriers to the use of research is still the lack of mechanisms that facilitate research use, even though we know that there are plenty of initiatives to do so. So one of the explanations, the possible explanation would be that these mechanisms are not known enough, or they are not efficient enough, or the third theory is that they are not coordinated enough. Maybe talking about coordination, Jonathan would give us some insights?
Yeah, we did talk about coordination. We talked about a lot of things. And one of the things in particular on coordination we talked about is the role between national and global. And often big global philanthropy can be really focused on global goods, and trying to think about, in particular, philanthropic incentives toward creating sustainable national infrastructure for evidence brokerage, and thinking about then how that national brokerage infrastructure relates to global goods. So how do we draw down from an evidence base to appropriately contextualize it, apply it, and think about how it can impact teachers and classrooms in a particular national system. We also talked a lot about the importance of comms. It's really easy to undervalue comms professionals, but actually, you know, talking as researchers isn't going to make effective brokerage. We talked about moving beyond comms and thinking about embedding evidence into aspects of the system, so things like teacher training, things like other policy initiatives. How do you ensure that evidence is not just catering to a self-selecting group that are choosing to visit your website, but is actually embedded in the systems across the country? And finally, around that philanthropy point, we talked about some of the incentives around philanthropy and how we can change incentives through both government and philanthropy to try and create more sustainability around brokerage functions. So having an accessible and translated evidence base is an incredibly cost-effective investment because it means all of your other investments can be spent much more effectively, but very few people are willing to commit the funding to build sustainable long-term institutions that can actually develop trust in the system and have that sustainable impact.
Thanks, John. I'll have to speed up a bit because I'm running late. So, Maria?
I will do a quick speed then. At the first table, we started with just a recap of, understanding what was shared, and then we talked a little bit about the fact that researchers don't necessarily do research for policy impact. Researchers do research for impact, but it might be for scholarly impact, it could be for practice impact, and very few actually think about that next step for policy impact. And so do we want researchers, is that the job for researchers? So then we went back to what Nóra said about is the right person for the right job, and talked a little bit about what does it look like to have a body of research that a broker or an intermediary uses and then filters that into policy recommendations. And then we talked a little bit about is research welcome in spaces that are anti-science, anti-research, and we talked about how it is about approach and it's about relationship and trust, and so really helping to see what is needed and how to build relationships and trust, and having people respect the space that you're coming from. In the second table that we were here, we shared about specific contexts and the work people were doing in the context, and some of the themes that came out there is that there are sometimes the intersection of a policy opportunity and a best practice, so you don't necessarily have the foresight to see that this policy opportunity is going to happen, but you can take advantage of a policy that will advance good work. So being open and recognizing those opportunities is important. And then we talked about the approach. So when communicating, it would be easy to go to a policymaker and say, hey, there's this new report on creativity. But if that's not their priority, that's not what is urgent for them, they're going to put it on the side with the 100 other reports. But if you go to them and you say, what's on top for you? You start from a space of inquiring about the needs of that person, that context, and then you find the intersection, because they were really concerned about critical thinking and problem solving. Oh, by the way, when we think about creativity, you can see these gains here. And so it's really having that relationship starting from a place of what is your need in this context, and what is your priorities, and then try to make an intersection between the need and the research and the policy.
Thanks, Maria. Tracy?
Okay, so I'll try and do this fast. And just hit a few big themes. I think one of the first big questions was around methods, and kind of articulating the idea that a lot of our big questions about education and about student learning are actually much more complicated that can be easily understood through very simple, small, discrete experiments, for example. And so what are the ways in which there are methods that we can articulate the research questions for very big questions that get at the kinds of things we want to answer, and what are reasonable methods to try and unpack that, and learning from other sectors that may have already been grappling this around what are the kinds of guidelines for combining quantitative and qualitative research, for example, And what are the ways we can learn from other sectors in other ways? And there was, Tommy gave a great example from Finland around science advice councils using efforts like science sparring or red teaming to really talk through issues and bring together multiple actors to kind of collectively problem solve solutions based on research and interaction. And one of the other things, and that's bridging me over to this table, is this question of finding these questions and getting the people around the table is one thing, but having action on it is another. And there are structures in our policy settings and in our research institutions which work against that. So if you have a dossier that is teacher training, you won't necessarily be able to action something that says, oh, this other thing needs to happen for teacher training to be effective. And so thinking around that systems perspective, how we also structurally deal with those disconnections is important. And just to say, we talked a lot about local and global. Jonathan, you covered that, so we won't go into it. And we started and ended with talking about the importance of trust and relationships and how much that is required for everything.
Thanks, Tracy. We also talk, if I may, on how to go from individual champions to more structured system, facilitating the use of research. And I think it's also a subject that was highlighted by other tables. Miquel?
Yes. I think the first conclusion is that being an intermediary is an absolute mess. So if we are about to talk about jazz band and we are in experimental jazz, absolutely scheme. And because we face a lot of challenges, but one of them is that tension between, and this is a topic that focused in our two tables. One of these tensions is about, or is between, you have to be somehow independent, neutral in the way you show results to policymakers, but at the same time, you may will to be collaborative and so participate in committees, in working groups with policymakers. And at the same time, you might want to press the policymaker fields towards a specific set of educational policies that have been showed by this research that work well for overcoming some needs. So that's not an easy triangle to combine. So being neutral, being collaborative, and doing some advocacy. And that thing at the end of the day lead us to what it is important to survive and to be more or less harmonic is to focus your action strategically on the base of a theory of action that makes sense, that it is solid, and that it is credible.
Thanks, Miguel. And last but not least, whoa, standing up.
I'm standing up, Jose, because it'll help me to be briefer. We talked about, in the two groups I was with, we talked about brokerage from the perspective of quality use. So thinking about, if we don't just want to increase the use of research, we want to improve the use of research. And what might that mean for brokers and brokerage? Two things. At the heart of using research well is the blend of appropriate research evidence and thoughtful engagement and implementation. And our sense, actually across both groups, is that brokers and brokerage organisations are doing a pretty good job on the appropriate research evidence. There's lots more understanding of how to translate research, how to make it, curate it in interesting ways. Perhaps an opportunity then is to lean into how can brokerage organisations support thoughtfulness in terms of the ways in which evidence is engaged with and implemented. And so the two ideas which came out, one was about walking the talk, Too often, brokerage organisations don't evaluate the effectiveness or the impacts of their own work. And too often, brokerage organisations connected to government organisations like school inspectorates don't make visible the evidence base upon which their standards are based. So walking the talk in terms of modelling quality use, how are we being thoughtful about the research that we're using, is one idea to lean into thoughtfulness. The other one was, I guess, around walking alongside, is that what thoughtfulness will look very different in different contexts. And so there has to be a really deep understanding of the practice of decision making or the practice of education practice. You know, like so an understanding of kind of not just walking the talk, but also walking alongside others in order to understand where, in what ways evidence might be helpful within that practice.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you all the facilitators, actually. There is a lot of food for thought for the upcoming weeks, at least for our team. I hope that for you too, especially since no one respected the 30 seconds rule. But maybe a round of applause for the facilitators. And for the last session, I will give the floor to Tia Lukula, head of the Center of Educational Research and Innovation.